The final story today is a very interesting story I've wanted to cover for a long time. It's as much a mystery as it is a ghost story, but it's one I know you'll love. Please like, subscribe, put notifications on, leave comments, all the good stuff. I do really appreciate it a lot. But now, let's get straight into the stories. I'm your host, Severed Soul. In the early 1990s, a small rural town in Nebraska was dealing with a growing number of abandoned buildings as families moved away following the decline of local industry. One of these buildings in particular had been known as a target for copper thieves, so police were instructed to just, keep a watchful eye on the place. Well, one evening, Lone Officer Ricky Hall was making his rounds. As usual, the town was quiet, and he was accustomed to long, boring and often uneventful shifts. As he passed by the house in question at around 7 o'clock in the evening, everything appeared normal. Or should we say, nothing appeared abnormal. The building itself was in bad shape with peeling paint and boarded up windows surrounded by undisturbed snow. Just 2 hours later, on his next pass, the officer noticed something different and, unexpected. You see, the back door of the house was now wide open, and it definitely hadn't been open when he passed by earlier. He immediately suspected a break-in, wondering what, if anything, was left to steal in that rundown building. So as he parked up his car and approached the house, something strange caught his attention. The property was surrounded by a layer of snow, at least a few inches thick, and yet there were absolutely no footprints in the snow leading to or from the door. The undisturbed snow created an odd contradiction since someone had clearly just opened the door, yet there were absolutely no signs of anyone entering or leaving. Still, Officer Hall called into dispatch, notifying them of the open door and requesting backup from the county sheriff. Shining his flashlights into the house, he saw the interior had been gutted over the years by various thieves, leaving debris and piles of rubble scattered across the floor. Strangely, the dust all over the floor also showed no signs of anybody walking through, with no prints inside or outside. So now Hall began to think the wind must have blown the door open. That was the only logical explanation as far as he was concerned. Well, just as he was about to secure the door, he heard a loud thump coming from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of children laughing. Yes, that is seriously creepy shit. So obviously, this completely startled him. So he called out thinking perhaps some kids had broken in to play around the house. But there was no response, just more laughter and playful sounds drifting from the upper floor. It did occur to him at this point, how could anyone have gotten into the house without leaving footprints in the snow or the dust? So once again he radioed into dispatch, this time saying he thought some kids were inside. Moving carefully through the kitchen towards the living room where the stairs were, the officer checked every corner, making sure to avoid the rotting floorboards as he navigated his way through the house. 2 more times he heard the distinct sound of children laughing and running around upstairs, but there was still no verbal response when he called out. Despite the strange atmosphere, he wondered if maybe he had made a mistake. Maybe it was just an animal making the noises. But the noises sounded undeniably childlike. Deciding he needed to investigate further, Hall, cautiously and apprehensively, made his way up the stairs. Well, as soon as he reached the second floor, the house went completely, eerily silent. The shift in sound from laughter to complete quiet heightened his sense of unease, and he felt like he had eyes on him from every direction. And then another thump echoed from the bedroom to his left. Now, at this point, Officer Hall is completely shitting himself, and who can blame him? Bracing himself, he approached the door cautiously, peeking around the corner to check inside. The room was empty, Well, apart from a pile of debris and some scattered furniture. But on top of the debris, something else caught his eye, and that thing was a piece of paper. As he moved closer to inspect it, he saw it was a page torn from a children's book. Now, what really disturbed him the most, though, was what was drawn on that piece of paper, because on that page was a child's crude sketch of a police officer, and the very moment he realised what he was looking at, the laughter returned, and this time it came from directly behind him. Spinning around with his gun raised, the officer found himself staring once again at an empty room. There was absolutely nobody there. Shaken and rattled, he left the house immediately, radioing into dispatch to report a false alarm. He flat out refused to return to that house, and whatever happened inside the house that night, he really didn't care to investigate further, even with backup. Now, when I first read this story, I must admit I did find myself asking questions about certain things that just didn't quite add up. But I liked the story and thought it was worth reading. So, when he was just 19 years old, Jason Young was working as a volunteer at EMT when he received a 911 dispatch to a house that had been abandoned for over 15 years. The whole situation just seemed odd to him from the start. I mean, why would anyone be calling from a place that hadn't been lived in for so long? Anyway, the police, fire and EMS all arrived on the scene, and after the police swept the house and declared it clear, Jason and his captain headed inside to do their own checks. So, the first questions I found myself asking were, and I must confess I have absolutely no clue how the emergency services do things in America, so please feel free to correct me. Would an EMT's superior be called a captain? And also, if the police have already done a full sweep of the property, then why would the medical team be doing their own checks after? So yeah, that doesn't really make sense to me. Anyway, on with the story. The house was an old farmhouse, and as they made their way to the top floor, the EMTs agreed that there was a certain chill in the air. I mean, the room was freezing cold. Strangely, one of the windows was wide open. Feeling the cold air streaming in, Jason moved to shut the window. The old frame made it difficult, and I'm sure the cold didn't help either. The hinges were very stiff, meaning that the window wouldn't open and close very easily at all. But with some effort, he managed to slam it shut, glancing out at the fire truck and ambulance parked below on the driveway. Upon hearing the noise, Jason's captain asked what it was, so Jason explained that he'd just closed the window that had been left open. Now, neither of the EMTs thought too much of this at the time. They then continued checking the rest of the house, crawl spaces, closets, and even the basement, which itself gave off a strange, almost suffocating feel. The atmosphere was heavy and oppressive, with the sense that something tragic may have happened there. Shackles were attached to a pillar, which they figured might have been used for farm animals during butchering, as one of the firefighters suggested. It all just felt off, but nothing about it seemed inherently dangerous. So they finished their sweep and headed back outside. As they stepped out the door, the captain looked back at the house and said to Jason, didn't you close that window? Looking up, Jason's heart sank. That window, the one that he had to struggle to close because the hinges were so stiff, yeah, that window was wide open again. He had definitely closed it, and it had taken a lot of effort to do so. Understandably confused, but not yet willing to jump to conclusions, he headed back inside. So he walked through the old farmhouse, half expecting to find that someone had snuck in. I mean, how else would the window be open again? He searched that whole house again, but it was completely empty, no sign of anyone having been in there, other than the open window. So, what did our young EMT do? He made sure to close the window again, double checking it this time to see if maybe it was spring-loaded or just didn't latch properly. He couldn't see any reason or any logical reason for the window to have opened again. It was just a normal hinged window. So he slammed the window shut once more, double checking the latch this time, leaving no doubt at all. Then he went back downstairs and outside to where the captain was standing. And once again, he looked up at the house to make absolutely sure the window had stayed shut. This time, something entirely different caught his eye. Something different and terrifying. You see, standing at the window, clear as day, was a man in a plaid shirt. The man, who was staring down at the EMTs from the darkness, placed his hand against the window before completely vanishing. Startled, Jason just couldn't shake the image from his mind. The figure had been unmistakable. A white man in his late 50s with short black hair, and just as quickly as the man appeared, he was gone. At first, Jason tried to brush it off, tried to convince himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But deep down, Jason knew what he'd seen, and it was really bothering him in quiet moments when he had time to collect his thoughts. So, this is just another thing that didn't make sense to me about this story. So, Jason isn't quite sure about what he'd seen. Now, I'm presuming here that Jason and his captain were standing right next to each other at the time. Maybe I'm wrong. But wouldn't you say to the guy standing next to you, "Can you see that man standing up at the window?" Surely you'd mention that, right? Well, according to Jason, after all this, he began to do some research on the property, wanting to know more about the history of the place and who lived there. To his surprise, a friend of Jason revealed that his uncle had lived on that very farm his entire life and was the last person to pass away in the house. The friend's uncle had lived with his parents, both of whom had also died in the home years earlier. Jason's curiosity deepened, so he asked his friend about the uncle, what he looked like and how he died. His friend's face went pale when Jason described the man as being in his late 50s with short black hair. The uncle had passed away from complications related to diabetes, not taking his insulin, and was found dead upstairs by his brother just a few days later. From that day on, Jason just couldn't drive by the house without thinking about that night. Every morning, on his way to work, he would glance up at that same window, saying a quiet prayer as he passed. The encounter, though brief, had a long-lasting impact. Before he saw that man, he was very sceptical about the paranormal, but since the encounter, he's very much a believer. Now, this next story is quite a well-known paranormal story here in the UK, and I remember hearing about it at the time and finding the whole case really interesting. It's a story I've always wanted to cover, so here it is. At around 7:20 p.m, on the evening of December 11th, 2002, a police department in Burpham in the county of Surrey, England, became inundated with frantic emergency calls by motorists who had been driving along a dual carriageway known as the A3, which runs straight through Burpham. Now, practically all of these motorists were saying the exact same things. They reported that they'd seen this totally reckless driver with super bright headlights that was weaving in and out of traffic at ridiculously high speeds, and if he wasn't stopped soon, there was going to be a nasty accident. And actually, a couple of the callers reported that they had even seen the car swerve off the road and go down into the embankments off the side of the highway. And so it looked very much like a crash might have occurred. After receiving so many urgent calls, Surrey Police Department dispatched a couple of officers to the scene to investigate. I've tried to find the names of the officers who attended the scene, but I can't find the names online anywhere. And when I say I've tried, I mean my best mate ChatGPT tried on my behalf. Anyway, when the two officers got out to the A3, they began patrolling the specific area on the A3 where the calls had come from, expecting to see some evidence of an accident. So what did they find upon arrival? Skid marks on the road? No. Damaged car parts or debris from a crash? No. Maybe some damage to the barriers at the side of the road? No. There were no signs of a car and no signs of a driver. In fact, there were no signs of an accident whatsoever. There was literally nothing to suggest that an accident had taken place. So, the police officers are looking at each other really confused, because let's just say only one person had called in about this wild, reckless driver having veered off the road down into a ditch. You could say, okay, there's been some kind of mistake, maybe even a prank. But so many people had called in to report the incident, reported seeing those bright headlights veer off down the road, down into the trees. There was just no way that this was a mistake. So, these two officers decided to just continue the search and really see if they can figure out where this driver had disappeared to. Now, up until this point, the officers had just been driving along the A3 to try and find the car, but they were having no luck, and so they decided to put the hazard lights on and pull up at the side of the road and venture down into the embankment on foot. Now, it should be noted that the county of Surrey is one of the most heavily forested areas in all of the UK. Now, when I say this, bear in mind this is the UK, not Canada, so when I say heavily forested, that is entirely subjective. So these forests on either side of the A3 are very dense, meaning that the officers couldn't really see very far in and through the trees. But sure enough, after walking for a while, one of the officers spotted something deep in the woods. It looked large and almost metallic or plastic, but whatever it was, it sure as hell didn't belong in the forests of Burpham. And so the officers made their way towards whatever this thing was. The closer they got to this thing, the more obvious it became that it was definitely a car wreckage. So once they'd realised exactly what they were looking at, the two officers began running towards the wreckage, and as they were running, they got on the radios and called for assistance. They reached the car on the driver's side, and they looked straight inside the car and couldn't see a driver in the driver's seat. But when they looked through the car to the passenger side, they noticed that the passenger door was wide open. So they ran around to the other side of the car, and when they saw what was on the ground at the other side of the car, they both froze on the spot, and once again, one of the officers got on the radio and requested backup immediately. Lying on the ground on the other side of the car was the body of a man, but on closer inspection, what they were seeing just didn't make any sense at all. Now, to understand why these police officers were so caught off guard by what they were seeing, we need to go back 5 months to July the 16th, 2002. According to the website aghostinmymachine.com, on that night, a 21-year-old named Christopher Brian Chandler finished up his beer at a pub in West London, about 1 hour north of that stretch of the A3. So Christopher had been to a pub with some close friends, but when he left the pub, none of his friends knew that he planned on climbing into his maroon Vauxhall Astra and driving down the A3 towards Surrey, very much under the influence of alcohol. Now, it should be mentioned at this point that Christopher was actually already wanted by the Met Police for robbery, so he wasn't exactly known for his moral compass. Now, given his current predicament, the only people who knew which pub Christopher was at that night were the group of friends he was with and his brother. So, when he hadn't heard from him for a period of time, it was in fact Christopher's brother who made the call to police and reported him missing. It's worth noting that his brother would have been well aware that the police were already looking for Christopher, so for him to call them to report him missing, he must have been very concerned for his brother's welfare. Disappearing for long periods of time wasn't exactly uncommon for Christopher, and so in the end his brother just presumed that he was laying low to evade the police. And the police also apparently felt the same way and just presumed that Christopher was hiding from them. So, as a result, nobody really followed up on Christopher's missing person report. Everyone just kind of moved on and presumed he'd show up when he needed something. Well, that was until 5 months later. Yes, you heard that right, 5 months later, when all those drivers began calling into the police in Surrey about seeing this totally reckless driver tearing down the A3. Spoiler alert, the car that the officers found was a maroon Vauxhall Astra, and the body was indeed the body of Christopher Brian Chandler. So you could presume that, okay, he left the pub that night, went on the lay-low for 5 months, then crashed his car driving recklessly down the A3. Where's the mystery in that, right? Well, here's the problem, and this is fucking crazy. When those two police officers ran through the woods and saw Christopher's car, they were immediately struck by how old the car looked. And when I say old, I don't mean a 1980s Vauxhall Astra. I mean, the car looked somehow rusted. Now, it didn't instantly register with them why this detail would be of concern. It just stood out to them that this is a really old, rusted up car. But also, the area around the car, as in the environment, the grass, the bushes, the trees, etc., didn't look like they'd just been decimated by a car crash. The area looked very much undisturbed. And what's more, the bodywork of the car, specifically the bonnet or hood if you're in America, was freezing cold to the touch. Not exactly consistent with a car that had crashed within the last 2 hours. But that wasn't all. You see, when they went around to look at the body on the ground, they would have expected to find the man unconscious, or if he had been killed in the crash, well, let's just say his body wouldn't have been in the condition they found it in. Christopher Chandler's body had decomposed to the extent that it was pretty much just a skeleton. Now, I must admit, I'm no forensic expert, but clearly, this means that Christopher did not crash and die on this night on December 11, 2002. He crashed and died 5 months earlier, right around the time he disappeared. Now, the Surrey police, they say that this was just all one big coincidence, that the reckless driver that all these motorists were reporting that night on the A3 probably hadn't crashed at all. Maybe he'd skidded and swerved slightly down the verge, then recovered and went merrily on his way. Then, just by sheer coincidence, when the police were searching that area of the A3 for the reckless driver, they just happened upon Chris and his car. The problem here is, remember, several of the drivers who called in that night about seeing this reckless driver on the A3, they specifically said they saw the car veer off the embankment and crash down below near the tree line. Like, this is a serious crash. Someone needs to get out here with an ambulance because, judging by the speed the car was travelling, someone definitely got hurt. Then, when the police got out and searched the exact area where this crash supposedly happened, by pure coincidence, they just happened to find Christopher and his smashed up car. I tell you what though, here's a thought. I wonder if anyone described the make and colour of the car when they called police to report the incident. That would be very interesting to know. So, the only reason the police ever found Christopher and his car is because of these calls. So we know for a fact it wasn't Christopher that those drivers saw. So what exactly happened? Now, some paranormal enthusiasts believe that what those motorists witnessed was a kind of replay of the incident, so to speak. Maybe Christopher's spirit was trying to lead people to his body. As of today, we don't really have a good explanation for what happened, and so the incident has been dubbed the A3 ghost crash. But I'd love to know what you think. Was this just all a very unlikely coincidence? Or did these motorists witness paranormal phenomenon? And that's all we have time for today. I hope you enjoyed those stories. If you did, show me some love by smashing the like button, maybe even consider subscribing to the channel. Leave any thoughts on the stories in the comments. Thanks very much for watching. I'm your host, Severed Soul. And that's all we have time for today. I hope you enjoyed those stories. If you did, show me some love by smashing the like button, maybe even consider subscribing to the channel. Leave any thoughts on the stories in the comments. Thanks very much for watching. I'm your host, Severed Soul.